Well, you remember that Jacob left home because he and his mother kind of came up with a plan. I guess she came up with a plan more. Rebecca did, and Jacob went in there and in essence stole the birthright from the blessing from his brother Esau, and then he had to flee from home, and he went to Uncle Laban's home, right? And he met the daughter of Laban, and Laban actually had two girls, and the one's name, the older was Leah, and the younger was Rachel. And which one did Jacob fancy more out of the two? He liked Rachel, and she was the younger one. But when it came, he worked for 7 years, and when it came to the wedding, Uncle Laban kind of pulled a fast one on him there. You know the story. We looked at that. He ended up marrying Leah instead of Rachel. He was pretty upset about that, but then things finally worked out, and he ended up marrying Rachel as well. And he worked 7 years for Leah, and then he worked 7 years for Rachel. And so the story picks up at the end of those 14 years. So Jacob's two wives, they now still staying in the region of Haran, where Laban is, and some things happen. So let's begin. Genesis chapter 30, looking at verse 1. It says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, 'Give me children or else I die.'" Now just to back up a little bit, at the end of chapter 29, it talks about the sons that Leah had. And here Rachel, she didn't have any children. And so you can imagine that there was a certain degree of jealousy that Rachel felt towards Leah. Having children back in Bible times was really an important thing for a woman. Every woman longed for motherhood. She wanted to have plenty of sons, and she wanted to, it was a degree of status back in those times. If you had lots of children, you seemed to be a person on a higher plane or higher level. You were wealthy and you were richly blessed by God because you had lots of children. And here, Rachel, she doesn't have any children, and yet her sister Leah is having all the kids, and she's having boys so far. She hasn't had any girls. And so there's jealousy that comes up, and you'll find in Song of Solomon chapter 8 verse 6, it says that jealousy is cruel as the grave. Probably true, right? She probably wished at times she could just die because she was so angry and jealous that Leah's having all the kids and she's not having anything. Yes?
On the way down here, I followed a truck that had a sticker on the back that says, "Children are a gift from God."
Yeah, there you go. You were driving down to Bible study tonight for friends who are listening, and you saw a bumper stick on the back of a car that said, "Children are a gift from God." And so it is, right? Yeah, okay. Now, just to kind of give us a little context, Sarah, who of course is the grandmother of Jacob, she waited for 25 years before she had Isaac. And then Rebecca, Jacob's mother, she didn't have kids for 20 years after Isaac and her were married, before she had Esau and Jacob. So it's kind of a history of waiting quite a while in the family before they actually have kids. And so we find Rachel rather upset because she doesn't have any kids. All right, verse 2 says, well, just to back up the last part of verse 1, and so she turns to Jacob and she says, "Give me children or else I die." As if somehow it's Jacob's fault that she's not having kids. Well, it's pretty evident the problem wasn't with Jacob because Leah was having plenty of kids. So nevertheless, she was so angry, so frustrated, she said, "You got to do something. I want to have a child." And perhaps she had been saying this more than once, and it was kind of wearing on Jacob. And I think that helps to explain a little bit as to what happens next here. Verse 2 says, "And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?'" So Jacob says, why are you crying to me? What can I do about it? I'm not God. I'm not the one that decides these things. So instead of Rachel going to God, as did Sarah and as did Rebecca, asking for a special blessing, she gets rather frustrated and angry and even begins to blame Jacob for this. And then verse 3 says, "So she said, 'Here is my maid, Bilhah. Go in to her, and she shall bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her.'" Now, it could be that she had been sort of nagging Jacob for a while, saying, why is it that I don't have kids? You got to do something. I want to have children. And maybe this had gone on for a while, so that when Rachel came up with the idea and said, hey, listen, take my handmaid, have a child with her, and I will adopt her. Now, the phrase that's given here, it says that I might have a child on my knees. Many Bible scholars feel that that was a Hebrew idiom meaning adoption at birth. So the handmaid would have the child, and immediately Rachel would adopt the child. Matter of fact, Rachel even names the child. So as soon as the child is born, Rachel adopts the child and says, this one is mine. And so she was trying to do something in order to have children. And probably because of the nagging, and Jacob heard enough of this, and he kind of thought, all right, well, let me just give in to what Rachel wants. And so he decides to have a child with her handmaid. Jacob's acceptance of Rachel's proposal demonstrated a lack of faith on the part of Jacob, and also a lack of faith on the part of Rachel. You'd think the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah would have been a good lesson to Jacob. Did things end well with Hagar and Sarah? And Abraham, remember, it turned out so bad that Abraham eventually had to send Hagar and Ishmael away because there's too much conflict between Sarah and Hagar. And so here we find him doing something similar. Verse 4 says, then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he also has heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. So here Rachel looked at the birth of Dan from her handmaid as being somehow an answer or a vindication of a cause by God. That yes, finally she's able to have at least have the opportunity to raise a child. It wasn't, of course, her child. And verse 7 says, Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So it wasn't just one child. She wanted more. Then Rachel said, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. So what was her motivation for wanting to have her maid be a third wife to Jacob? What was the real reason? You can kind of see it in the name that she gave this second child. She says, I've been wrestling with my sister and I finally have prevailed. What was the motivation? Was it just to have children, or was it somehow to deal with her sister? There was so much jealousy between the two of them. She wanted to somehow vindicate herself. Yeah, kind of like one-ups. Yeah, who can have the most kids, right?
Well, the deceit was probably never resolved in her heart. She knew that Jacob loved her, and she always resented her sister for sliding in there.
Okay, that's a good point. Maybe it stemmed all the way back to the marriage when Rachel said, it should have been me that he married first, and here you kind of snuck in. And then to make things worse, you're the one that's having all the baby boys, and I'm barren, I can't have any. So she had, reason, at least in her own mind, to be rather upset about the whole thing. And then verse 9 says, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. So it wasn't good enough just for Rachel. Now Leah's saying, hey, wait a minute. I'm going to take my maid, and this is going to be a fourth wife of Jacob, and she's going to have children, and I'm going to adopt them just like Rachel adopted them. So there's really a race to see who can get the most kids. That's really what it's boiling down to here. Yes?
They probably didn't have that expression back then, a happy wife is a happy life.
Yeah, there's an expression, a happy wife is a happy life. Well, I think Jacob, to some degree, although he should have exercised more faith in God and trusted that, God's will ultimately be done, as Isaac did, but he kind of gave in a little bit, I guess, trying to maybe keep peace in the family, trying to keep the girls happy, and so he kind of went along with it instead of standing his ground and saying, no, this is not God's will. But, you already had taken that second wife, and then to take a third, and a fourth, why not? And so, the whole sanctity of marriage, and at least the way God had designed it in the beginning, they were pretty far from that ideal, and you could see the consequences of that. Yes?
With all the faith that Abraham was famous for having, he didn't have faith on this subject either.
All right. Well, what about all the faith of Abraham? It doesn't seem like Jacob got a whole lot of that faith. But did he eventually develop a faith that took a hold of the promises of God? Yes, he had to learn it the hard way, and of course the story reveals that as you go on a little further. Just like Abraham had to learn and exercise faith, and Isaac had to exercise faith, so Jacob has a test of his faith, and that comes up a little later in the story. Now, can you think of any other Bible characters that there was a man that had more than one wife? Matter of fact, he had two wives, and the one that he loved the most was barren, and the second wife apparently was the one that had all the kids, and it brought tremendous pain to the wife that he loved. You know who I'm talking about? Hannah and Peninnah was the other wife, and this is Elkanah's wives, and he loved Hannah, but Hannah was barren, and it brought great pain. And it didn't seem that Elkanah could do anything to try and ease the pain. He'd give her a double portion, a double blessing, and it was evident to her that Hannah was his favorite wife, but still she longed to have children. But what did Hannah do? Did she come up with some idea and say, well, if I can't get kids, then I'm going to give my maid to my husband? No. What did she do? The Bible tells us she went to the temple and she brought a request before the Lord. And she prayed about it, even with tears. And God heard her prayer. And of course, you know, Samuel was the son that she had, and Samuel became a great champion. Became great champion in Israel. He was both a priest as well as a prophet, and just an amazing story. So there we have the example of Hannah who put her faith in God, and God rewarded it, versus here you have Rachel trying to work things out her own way, and it didn't turn out good in the end. All right, verse 10. It says, and Leah's maid, Zilpah, bore Jacob a son. So you remember Rachel's maid bore Jacob two sons. Now Zilpah, Leah's maid, bears him a son. And Leah said, a troop comes, so she called his name Gad. Once again, the idea behind this was if your maid bears a son to your husband, you adopt that child immediately at birth, and you get to actually name the child. So that's why Leah is naming this child instead of Zilpah. And you wonder what kind of a relationship, or how did Zilpah feel towards Leah after her baby was taken away? Must have kind of been similar to how Hagar and Sarah felt in their relationship. So it wasn't a good thing that was happening here. All right, then it says, Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, just like Rachel's maid. And Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. So it's also interesting to note that in the birth of Leah's own sons, she acknowledges God as being the one who blessed her. But when it comes to the two sons, or the two boys that her maid has, instead of acknowledging God, she comes up with another name. First of all, she says, a troop shall come, meaning there's going to be other children born. And then she says, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she doesn't make any acknowledgement or recognition that God is the one who is giving the blessing. If you look in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31, just go back one chapter, you can see how Leah recognizes God when she has a child. Verse 31 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, and Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, the Lord has surely looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And then 33 says, and then she conceived again and bore a son, and she said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me a son. And she called his name Simeon. So here you'll notice in the naming of her own sons, she recognizes God as being the one who gives. But in the birth of her maid's son, or sons, she doesn't acknowledge God, which is kind of interesting. It's as if it was almost a matter of pride, or maybe there was, a response to jealousy with her sister, and they lost sight of God being the one who brings the blessing. They weren't exercising faith in God to fulfill his word. They were trying to work things out on their own terms. And that's brought some trouble, as you know, later on in the story. Okay. Well, let's look at the next verse. This will be verse 14 now. It says, now Reuben went out in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. Now, does anyone know what mandrakes is and what that's all about? Yes, there was a plant. It's part of the nightshade family. It grows in the Middle East. Now, there are some of the nightshade plants that are actually poisonous, and some of them are used for different types of medicine. But this particular type of nightshade family plant, it has white and purple flowers, and the berries is yellow berries, and I guess they're fairly big. They look almost like crab apples, if you've eaten those little crab apples. And it was believed that these mandrakes, it was one of these natural remedies that would make you fertile, and if you ate the mandrakes, you were guaranteed to get pregnant, kind of thing. And it seems to me that as early as there was motherhood, there was probably all kinds of ideas and theories out there on how you can get pregnant. How can you be fertile and have a child? And of course, that had come down for centuries. And here was a common belief in the area that if you eat these mandrakes, it's going to somehow make you fertile. Well, Rachel sees Leah's boy coming with these mandrakes. She says, I got to get that. Maybe that's going to be the cure. Maybe I am going to have a child after all. And so she says, give me the mandrakes. And of course, Leah says, no, wait a minute. You can't take the mandrakes that he's brought for me. On the one hand, Rachel's probably thinking, well, Leah, you've had enough kids. I need that because I don't have any kids. And Leah says, no, you can't take it. Well, let's look at verse 15. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Notice what she says. Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Was it pretty clear to Leah who Jacob loved the most? Yes. Matter of fact, you'll notice later in the story that Jacob wasn't even staying with Leah. Leah and Rachel weren't staying in the same tent. At this time they probably weren't in tents. They were still close to where Laban was. But Rachel was staying, or rather Jacob was staying with Rachel. That was his favorite wife. And poor Leah, she's kind of on the outside of things. And so Leah says, now you want to take my mandrakes, and you've already stolen my husband's affection. Well, in reality, you kind of feel sorry for Leah because Rachel, of course, was the first love of Jacob. And I don't know how much she was influenced by her father or if she had a part to play in it. But, where she stepped in instead of Rachel at the wedding, and she ended up marrying Jacob first, and Jacob got all upset about that and angry. So she started her marriage with Jacob on a very bad note, bad foot. And she was always trying to win his affection somehow. And so she thought, well, if I have lots of kids, surely now he's going to love me. And yet that didn't work out that way for her. And, now Rachel wants to take something that's her. So she comes up with a deal. It's kind of an interesting deal here in verse 15. And Rachel said, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So she figured, all right, well, I will tell him that he needs to, when he comes home, he needs to spend the night over at your place. And I am going to take the mandrakes, hoping still that somehow that's going to give her fertility and she's going to be able to have kids. And then Jacob will really love her. That's what she's thinking. If I have a kid, then I know Jacob will really love me. And so verse 16, it says, when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Verse 17, it says, and God listened to Leah. Notice, was this something that Leah had been praying about, this problem she had with Rachel and with her husband? And for a while she hadn't had any children. Doubtless she had prayed about it at some point, because it says God listened to Leah in verse 17, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. So how many sons has Rachel bore to Jacob? None at this point. Her maid has bore 2 sons. Well, here you have Leah that has already of herself bore 5 sons, and Leah's maid has bore 2. And so you notice Leah has a lot more kids than Rachel, and yet Jacob's affection is still to Rachel. And again, you wonder what Jacob was thinking. Maybe he's just trying to keep the peace here, but it seems like he's kind of been pulled back and forth between the 2 sisters, right? And he's trying to please the one, and then the other one gets upset, and he tries to please the other one, and then that one gets upset, and he's just kind of going back and forth. And he couldn't have been a very happy man for a while there, it seems. Okay.
Well, Pastor,
Yes.
where does this all start where you can just go lay
Okay, where did it start that you could just you could just take any wife? Now, if you were to, you know, for example, where Rachel gave her handmaid or Leah gave her maid to Jacob, the maid actually became one of Jacob's wives. The maid was still under the control of Rachel, but she did have certain privileges as the wife of Jacob. So there was a bond. He had to take care of her. Her children were recognized as his children, just like the children of his real wives. So there, you know, to take on a maid and take on as a wife, it was a wife. Now, where did that come from? Well, this was such a big thing in Bible times, and probably still in some cultures, that if you didn't have children, it was grounds for divorce. Your husband could divorce you if you didn't have kids, and your husband had a right to take a second or third wife if he chose, if his first wife was unable to give him kids. It was such a big deal back in that culture. And if you think about it, everything revolved around these clans and families, and your wealth and your prosperity depended upon you having lots of kids. They'd work in the farm, and they work with the animals, and it was a big cultural accepted thing that you needed to have kids. And if a woman did not have children, she was considered cursed by God. And it was something that no woman wanted. And I think that's part of the motivation why Rachel was so eager even to give her maid. She would do anything to try and have a child, because the whole culture was kind of built around that. That doesn't excuse what Jacob was doing, or Rachel or Leah and the maids. It was so common in that society that they kind of adopted some of these traditions, but it was never God's ideal. And if you look at the story, the reason we have these stories in the Bible is because you look at what happened. It wasn't a happy marriage. It wasn't a happy marriage with Sarah and Hagar and Abraham, and it's definitely not a marriage right here, a happy marriage with Jacob and his two wives. Yes?
Now they call it a surrogate mother, but even in today, when a woman carries a man's child for the other woman, there's a lot of tension there.
Oh, absolutely.
It's hard for them to give that baby up to them. It's a part of them.
Yes, if you've gone through 9 months and you've nurtured this child, there is a bond that is developed. And it's kind of unfair on the maid as well. The minute she didn't really have a choice involved, because she was a maid, almost a servant. She didn't have a choice involved. She had this child, and suddenly now it's recognized as Rachel's child or Leah's child. And of course, that became a problem with Sarah and Hagar early on in the story. As you know, yes, did I see a hand here somewhere?
Oh, yeah. Now, I've always been taught that the Ten Commandments, really, even though they weren't written by the finger of God on stone, were already the law, though, and that were recognized as the law by...
Oh, absolutely. The principles of the Ten Commandments have
That's
always
not
been there.
adultery.
How is this not adultery? Because they didn't view it as, they didn't view marriage as one man and one wife. They recognized marriage as being more of a legal transaction that would often occur between families. Now, having said that, if you took an extra wife as a man, you were responsible for that wife. You were responsible for her well-being. You were responsible for the children she had. You would have to take care of her. And even back in the time when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, God made the provision that if your husband died and you didn't have any children, it was the responsibility of your husband's brother to take you as a second wife to try and raise up a seed, so at least you would have someone to take care of you when you get old, and you'd have some kind of an inheritance to keep your family name going. So those provisions were made because things were quite different back in those days. If you didn't have any children, especially when you got older, you were in big trouble. You didn't have any help. So that's part of why the Bible says in the New Testament, God winked at their ignorance, but now we know better, and he calls people to repentance. However, having said that, we find many examples in the Bible of people that were true to their one spouse, and the Lord blessed it. So that's always been God's ideal. All right, well, let's keep going here and see what happens next. Where did we finish up? Was that 17? Yes. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. So it was a difficult thing for Leah to give her maid to Jacob. And she says, you see, God has rewarded me for that act of selflessness. she thought somehow that was a good thing, which it wasn't, but at least that was the way she perceived it. All right, verse 19. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Well, did that work out for her? You notice how that Leah, this whole time, is earnestly trying to win the affections of Jacob. And I think that's part, on the one hand, Rachel is jealous towards Leah because she doesn't have any children of her own. And Leah is jealous towards Rachel because she knows that Jacob loves Rachel more than he loves her. And so they both have cause for jealousy, and it's going back and forth, and Jacob's kind of in the middle. And verse 21. It says, and she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. So this is still Leah. After she has 6 sons, she has a girl. And it's not very often that they list the names of the girls in the family tree, but in this case they do. And the reason for that is because Dinah is actually the subject of a rather sad occurrence that you read about later on. It's actually chapter 34, and we get to that a little later on. But Dinah was the oldest of Jacob's girls. She was not the only girl. You read later on that he had other daughters as well, but she's the only one that's actually mentioned by name, possibly because of what happens later on in the next couple of chapters where she's involved in the story, and also because probably she was the oldest of Jacob's girls. All right, then finally, verse 22. It says, and God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Had she just trusted God from the beginning, would she have had a son? Yes. God would have given her one had she trusted him, and all of that other confusion would have been avoided. So eventually, it seems that Rachel just takes her problem to the Lord like Hannah and pours her heart out and says, please, Lord, you have to do something. And God answers her prayer, and she has a son. Verse 23, and she conceived and bore a son and called and said, God has taken away my reproach. Now remember, as you said early in Bible times, if a woman did not have any children, it was a terrible reproach. It seemed that she was under some kind of curse. And finally she says, the Lord has taken away my reproach. I'm not under this curse any longer. And verse 24, so she called his name Joseph. Now in the midst of all of these various Bible characters that you find in the book of Genesis, the Bible reveals to us their good points, the times when they were strong in faith, and it also reveals their bad points. The Bible is very honest, reveals to us what good choices do and what bad choices do. But when we come to the Bible character of Joseph, he is just a shining example of somebody who made good choices, it seems, their entire life. Now, I'm sure there were times where obviously Joseph made the wrong choice, but they're not even mentioned. Quite possibly because of the big decisions that Joseph was faced with. He always submitted to God's will. He sought God's leading and God's will. And he stands forth as just a champion of faith. And it came through a lot of pain, a lot of sorrow. Rachel spent many a night in prayer and in tears to have a son. And finally, when God answered the prayer, Joseph comes along, who is just a great inspiration, even to us today, of a man of faith and courage and trust in God. It's an incredible story. And he ends up saving the life of his entire family, because remember, there's a famine that comes later on in the land, and they all end up going down to Egypt, and in Egypt, Joseph provides for them, and the family flourishes while it is in Egypt. So, very important Bible character. All right, verse 25, it says, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away, that I might go to my own place and to my own country. So this is about 14 years after Jacob arrived with Laban, or at Laban's home. He had worked 7 years for Rachel. He ended up with Leah, and then he worked for another 7 years and for Rachel, and of course he married both of them, and so it's been 14 years. Finally he says, the time has come, I need to go home. And so he says to Laban, his uncle, he says, I'm ready to go. And what does Laban say? Is Laban excited to see him go? No, not really, because he knows that God is with Jacob and has blessed Jacob. Verse 26, he says to Laban, give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go. for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. So Laban was blessed because of the faith of Jacob. Verse 28, then he said, Name me your wages and I'll give it to you. So Laban doesn't want Jacob to go, and he says, I've been blessed because you've been here, but I do realize that you can't work for nothing, so you just tell me what you want. Name me your wages and I'll give it to you. And even though Jacob does name his wages, you read late in the story that in the next 6 years, Laban changed his wages 10 times. So Laban was a bit of an interesting character, and when he saw how God was blessing Jacob, or Jacob's flocks, as we'll find in just a minute, Laban kept changing the rules, and he did it 10 times in 6 years. So even though he started off by saying, you name your wage, well, he didn't really mean that, all right? He changed that along the way, and we'll see that happening. All right, let's look at verse 29. So Jacob said to him, You know that I've served you, and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my house? Verse 31, so he said, What shall I give you? And Jacob said, You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed your flocks and keep them. So now he's asking again, all right, what do you want me to pay you? And Jacob, being wise, he says, actually, I don't want you to pay me anything. I want us to work out some kind of a deal. And you'll see that it's God that's paying me. I'm not going to be dependent upon you. What did Abraham say after his great victory with those kings that came down and took Lot and his family and conquered Sodom and Gomorrah? Remember the story? And took them back, and Abraham went with his trained servants, and he gained a victory, and he got all of this possession, and he traveled back. And then they said to Abraham, listen, you take what's yours, just feed our guys and that kind of thing. And Abraham said, no, I'm not going to take any of this stuff, lest you say that you are the ones that made Abraham wealthy. He said, I'm not going to take anything of this, just the food that the men ate, but I want you to recognize God's blessing upon me. I don't want you to think that somehow you are the one that blessed me. God is the one that blessed me. And Jacob is doing the same thing. He says to Laban, I don't want you to think that I'm blessed because of something you've done. No, I'm blessed because of what God has promised me. And I'm trusting in God to provide for me, which is a good thing. He says, all right, well, here's the deal. This is what we want you to do. Verse 32, let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all of the speckled and the spotted sheep, and all the brown ones amongst the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And these shall be my wages. Now, it started out with this being just a small group of the goats and the sheep that had brown spots or speckled or striped or whatever they might be. It was just a small group, and when Laban heard this, he thought, wow, this is a good idea. I have all of this, and he just gets a few of these little goats and sheep. Not a bad deal, because you'll notice his response, verse 33. So my righteousness, this is still Jacob speaking, he says, so my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes up before you, everyone that is not speckled or spotted amongst the goats and the brown amongst the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. So I want you to recognize that it's God that's going to bless me. You just give me the ones, these spotted and speckled ones, and then we'll see what God's going to do. All right, verse 35. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted. Now, when it says in verse 35, so he, that's referencing Laban. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, everyone that had some white in it, and all the brown ones amongst the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his sons. So this is Laban that gives these speckled and spotted sheep and goats into the hands of his sons. Verse 36, then he put a 3 days journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So all the speckled and spotted ones Laban took apart from the rest. Now, why do you suppose he did that? Because these guys knew something about breeding different animals, and they knew what sort of traits would be dominant. So if you have a speckled goat and you have a white goat, let's say, and you breed the two, there's a 50-50 chance that the baby goat will be speckled, or maybe 50-50 it will be white. But of course, if you have a speckled male goat and a speckled female goat, and they're young, there's probably an 80% chance, maybe even higher, that they would be speckled and spotted. So Laban says, all right, well, let me grab all of the ones out of the flock that are speckled and spotted. That would then presume that the rest of the goats and the sheep, their offspring is going to be like the parents. They're not going to be speckled and spotted. That way I will become wealthy and Jacob will have just a small little group, just the ones that he pulled out. And then they're not going to grow as fast as mine. That's his rationale. Laban is, he's a little bit of a deceiver himself, and he thinks, hey, this is a good deal. This works to my favor. But of course, God had a different plan. So let's see what happens here. This is verse 37 now. It says, now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and almonds and chestnut trees. He peeled white stripes in them and exposed the white which was in the rods. Verse 38, and the rods which he peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth speckled and streaked and spotted. Now, a lot of people have asked, now, what is this about these sticks? And he kind of peeled back the bark a little bit. So you have part brown, and then you have a little white streak and a spot. And when the animals came to the drinking troughs, and the animals would come, and that would be the time of the year when mating would take place. And he took the sticks and he put them in the watering trough, and he thought that maybe, that would help, that there would be speckled and spotted offspring that would come from these animals. Now, it was commonly believed back in Bible times that even though selective breeding was something that they definitely practiced and they understood what that was, they also believed that there were certain environmental factors that influenced the coloration of the animals. They believed that if, for example, a sheep at the point of, if she's going to have a baby or during the pregnancy, if she were to get a fright, or if she were to see a sheep that was speckled or spotted, that somehow her baby would be speckled and spotted. So they thought that somehow there were environmental factors that would influence the coloration of the animals. And this was commonly believed. So they knew what selective breeding was, so they would get the strong animals to mate together and so on, but they also thought, there's these environmental factors that could influence the coloration. So Jacob, following along, doing everything he could, he carved up these sticks and put it in the water. Now, we know that that's not really why Jacob had so many goats and sheep that ended up being speckled and spotted and brown. And yet God still allowed, let me put it this way, despite Jacob's efforts to try and make wealth, God was still teaching him a lesson, because you find in Genesis chapter 31, which is the next chapter, God actually reveals to Jacob quite clearly why it was that he became so wealthy and why all of the animals seemed to be speckled and spotted and brown. It wasn't because of some sticks that he put in the watering trough, but it was actually God that was blessing him. So if you look in Genesis 31, verse 11 and 12, now he's telling the story to his wives, and he's recounting what God had just shown him. It says, and it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted up my eyes, and I saw in a dream. And behold, the rams which leapt upon the flocks were streaked and speckled and grey spotted. Then the angel of God spoke unto me in the dream, saying, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lift up your eyes now and see, all the rams which leap upon the flock are streaked and speckled and grey spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. And you can read on the next few verses. It tells us that it was clearly God that was giving him the increase. It wasn't some strange thing that he was doing in carving out sticks, but it was God that was actually hearing his prayer and rewarding him for his faithful dealings with Laban for all those many years. So despite at least Jacob thinking that somehow this would help, God was eventually showing him, or did show him in a dream, no, it's me that's blessing you. That's why you have become wealthy. All right, well, let's look at verse 40. It says, Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flock face towards the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. but he put his own flock by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock. So once he begins to notice that you got the streaked and the speckled and that kind of thing, the next thing, not only did he carve up the bark of the sticks, but he had all of the sheep look at the speckled and spotted and streaked ones as if somehow that was going to make a difference. Again, it was a common belief that the environment kind of influenced the coloration of the sheep and the goats. And so he's doing everything in his power to try and increase his wealth, but ultimately it's God is the one that actually blesses him. And it's not until the next chapter that it becomes very evident that no, God is the one that was giving him the increase. It wasn't any of his techniques or the things that he was trying to do. Although there was one thing that he did that probably did help, and that's verse 41. It says, "And it came to pass whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutter, that they might conceive amongst the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger was Jacob." So there is some scientific evidence in that. Of course, you're going to want to have the strongest of the flock breed together, and their offspring will be stronger as well. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and he had large flocks, female and male servants, camels, and donkeys. So although Jacob did what was commonly believed to make a difference, God eventually showed him that it was God that was blessing him, and it wasn't what he was doing. Now, that was a lesson that God wanted to teach Jacob, that it's God is the one who provides the blessing. It's not by our works. That was the same lesson that God wanted to teach Leah as well as Rachel, that God was the one that gave them the blessing. In the case of Leah and Rachel, what was the blessing they were seeking? They wanted to have children. In the case of Jacob now, when he's trying to provide for his family, what is the blessing that he's looking for? Well, he's looking for goats and sheep that have speckled and brown spots and whatever, because that's his. So both in the case of Leah and Rachel wanting to be blessed, wanting children, God was directing their attention to him as being the source of the blessing. When it came to the animals and the wealth of Jacob, God was again directing Jacob to God being the source of wealth. And yet God allowed Jacob to try and do his own thing, and God allowed Leah and Rachel to try and do their own thing, and yet through that God was still working with them. And God works with us the same way. He allows us to learn, hopefully, from our experiences and our mistakes. He kind of leads us step by step, right? Trying to help us understand that He is the source of our blessings. He is the one that we need to turn to with every trial and every difficulty. And that's one of the lessons I think that we can gather from this story is God is teaching Jacob and his wife some very important lessons that would come to play later on when we find Jacob actually going back home. And the trials of his faith that he faces later on, he was learning some very important lessons right here.